Michael Palmer, thank you for joining me in the trenches. What is your background?
Oh, I'm a medical doctor by training. So I got my training in Germany, where I grew up. And after doing research in microbiology and biochemistry for a decade at Mainz University with Sucharit Bhakti, I went to North America and ended up in the year 2001 at the University of Waterloo in the chemistry department, where I taught biochemistry, did research on biochemistry for 2 decades. And in 2022, I was sacked there because I refused to take the poisonous COVID shot. And since then, I have been amusing myself at home and writing stuff. And
the COVID era significantly changed the paradigms of so many people, including myself. It was a good thing, wasn't it, in many ways?
Yeah, it was. I had been set, let's say, half awake to a few things before that, but COVID actually did manage to shock me. I mean, one way in which it shocked me was really that I fully realized how difficult it is for many people to even look at inconvenient facts and draw the obvious and appropriate conclusions, even if those are not inherently difficult from a scientific or logical point of view. Just simply, they seem to block them out because they are inconvenient, they don't fit their worldview, they would be upsetting if fully taken on board, and so therefore they are simply refused, they are blocked out. And that I didn't really understand this, the extent of this problem before, I must say. So in the COVID era, I came to realize how many people are affected by it. But on the other hand, obviously, there was a substantial minority of people, let's say, that actually did wake up and during this era and realized that the deceptions went a lot deeper and further than just COVID alone.
What is the central hypothesis here?
Okay, so I'm concerned specifically with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, there was also a very substantial conventional bombing campaign beginning with the large raid on Tokyo in March 1945. It had started before that, but this was the first really large-scale conventional attack. So I am specifically concerned with the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the conclusion that I reached during my research, I looked into this topic for about 2 years and wrote a book on it. And the conclusion is that there were no nuclear bombs, no atomic bombs in either city. On the other hand, these were not just simply regular fire bombings, but instead the Americans indeed tried to fake the appearance of true atomic bombings, of nuclear detonations. And there is both physical evidence and medical evidence that points to this conclusion, both that there were no true atomic bombings, but also that the Americans did try to fake the appearance of such bombings. As I say here on the title slide, right, I already mentioned that the Americans tried to fake the appearance of atomic bombings, and 2 key ingredients of this fakery were napalm and mustard gas, right? Both were used in staging these attacks. Napalm had been used also in the fire bombings. It was indeed the most widely used incendiary in those conventional fire bombings. But the use of napalm was a little bit disguised in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I think. And mustard gas was a specific ingredient that was used to create the so-called radiation sickness. Mustard gas has effects that are similar to true radiation, and I think there is pretty good evidence that indeed this was used instead of radioactivity or nuclear radiation.
Why do you think, Michael, that so few people understand this particular argument?
Well, I mean, the narrative has been drummed into our heads from very early on. So I think most people just simply, they don't even listen to the possibility. I think they just shut off immediately if you suggest to them that this might be another fake story. So that's the first point. I must say I have not come across any other books that specifically postulate the use of mustard gas in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I have seen books that claim that both cities were simply firebombed in the same way that the other cities in Japan were firebombed, and I think that really is not correct. I think that rides roughshod over a lot of eyewitness evidence and also over physical and medical evidence. And indeed, if you look at the medical and physical evidence in a superficial sort of way, or you look only at a small segment of it, you might persuade yourself that after all, there must have been atomic bombs. So you really have to look closely and you have to look at the entire picture in order to understand that this evidence was indeed staged and faked. And I think I will... go ahead.
There is that Japanese engineer, I can't remember his name now, but he wrote, he didn't say the same as you, but he did say that there was no evidence of an atomic bomb.
That's correct. So this author, I think you mean Akio Nakatani.
Yes, that's him. That's him.
Okay. So I think that this is a pen name, and from the writing style, I get the impression that he's an American. Other than that,
okay.
Other than that, I also do get the impression that his qualifications are indeed real. So he claims to be an expert in applied mathematics, and I see nothing in his writing style and in his conclusions that contradicts that claim. I think that is real. I think he simply took a pen name, a Japanese pen name, in order to protect his identity. So that's it. But he claims, it's quite interesting actually. So he claims to have carried out computer simulations, which is what an applied mathematician would do, that simulate the time course of a nuclear chain reaction inside a bomb. And what he concludes is, as far as I can understand his somewhat incomplete description of those simulations, is that the chain reaction simply proceeds too slow. If it is too slow, right, then the energy is released not quite fast enough. So what happens is that before the chain reaction has enveloped enough of the nuclear fuel, the critical mass is already blown apart. So the chain reaction can only continue as long as the critical mass stays together. And if the energy is released in a somewhat successive fashion, right, then the material that is affected by it heats up, and then things simply blow apart, and then the detonation sort of fizzles. So that means without a strong containment, you cannot create a strong detonation. That seems to be his conclusion, and he apparently has done this separately, both for the uranium bomb supposedly used in Hiroshima and for the plutonium bomb supposedly used in Nagasaki. And he therefore concludes that these bombs could not have worked. He takes it further and says that no atomic bombs, no nuclear weapons could work at all at any time. That may be so, but I cannot really judge this. I am not an engineer, a nuclear engineer, this sort of thing by training, and I don't have enough insight into how general these conclusions are really applicable. So I leave that up to others. I really hope that at some point a nuclear physicist or a nuclear chemist will do a detailed analysis of all the fallout left behind by the nuclear tests in later time periods and figure out what really went on there. So I do think that some sort of nuclear detonations were staged. Now, if I were asked to fake a nuclear bomb test, what I would propose to do, I couldn't do it myself, but what I would propose to do is to simply build an underground reactor with a strong containment, and then just simply let it go critical, just the same way that Chernobyl, that the nuclear reactor in Chernobyl just went out of control. You simply let the chain reaction build, and it just will take as long as it takes, no matter whether it's fast or slow. It will continue on building until the pressure inside the thing gets too high and the containment blows up. So the strength of the detonation would then be limited not so much by the amount of nuclear fuel inside it, but by the strength of the containment. And that's what I suspect was done, at least in some of the later nuclear tests. So, I already commented on the use of mustard gas, so I don't think I need to repeat this. So then we can go on. As mentioned, many listeners may disbelieve the entire idea and will not be willing to give it much time at all. So therefore, I want to start off with some official documents from the Manhattan Project, which themselves plainly contradict the official narrative. So we start with a quick summary of the official story. There were supposed to have been 3 nuclear detonations during the year 1945. The first was the bomb test on July 16th, 1945. This was said to have been a plutonium bomb. And then the next one was the bomb supposedly dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th. And then 3 days after that, the plutonium bomb on Nagasaki was dropped. So, interestingly enough, the uranium bomb supposedly used in Hiroshima was never tested even once. So the scientific genius of the Manhattan Project allegedly just knew it would work and that no test would be necessary. That already sounds a little bit like something out of Hollywood and not so much out of real life. But okay, let's compare the story to some official documents. Here we have Arthur Compton, physics Nobelist, who was the head of the physics division of the Manhattan Project. And he was particularly keen on developing the plutonium bomb technology and spoke on this topic at a secret meeting on May 31st, 1945. And you actually can find the protocol of that meeting on the internet. And what he says here at the meeting is that plutonium had not yet been purified. It would take 2 more years from that date, from May 45, to purify plutonium, and then about 1 more year to obtain plutonium in sufficient quantity for building bombs. And if you read the entire protocol carefully, then you will also come to the conclusion that even reactor-grade uranium, so there are 2 grades of uranium, very much in the news again now in connection with Iran, right? So you enrich uranium-235 from its natural abundance of approximately 0.7% to about 3% in order to use it in a reactor. And in the Hiroshima bomb, it was supposedly enriched to 80%, so very much higher. And at the time of this meeting, even reactor-grade uranium was still in very short supply, so it is very unlikely that uranium bombs could have been built at the time. But nevertheless, at this meeting, Compton claimed that uranium bombs were already in production, probably to impress the politicians who were also in attendance at the meeting. Okay. Now, if indeed there were already multiple such bombs, then you would expect that such a bomb would have been tested before being used in war against Hiroshima. And interestingly, in this connection, we have the report of this young man, Robert Wilson, a very capable physicist. He oversaw the experimental research at Los Alamos. So he was reporting to Compton, I suppose. Now, what he reports on is that very hurriedly in the critical days before the first nuclear explosion, he carried out an experiment to make sure that none of the nuclear fission reactions were delayed beyond a certain period of time, certain amount of time, because this delay would have deleterious effects on the efficiency of the explosion. What this means is, until he had done this experiment, they couldn't be sure that the uranium bomb would work, right? So this would be a very good reason, as already stated, for testing such a bomb, but this test was not carried out. Interestingly enough, he also seems to have been under the impression that the first bomb test would use uranium, not plutonium. So this would be a contradiction to the official story as well, right? So we have both Compton and Wilson in their reports, in their respective reports, plainly contradicting the official story of the first three nuclear detonations, in particular of the use of plutonium bombs in the first bomb test and in Nagasaki. So we don't even have to go any further than just official documents of the US government to come up with some reasons to doubt the official story. So then we have to decide what really happened there. So we should look at the evidence ourselves. So then what sorts of evidence are usually cited to support the official story of the atomic bombings, right? So we have the evidence of total annihilation of the two cities. Then we have radioactive fallout left behind by these bombings. Then we have the victims of radiation sickness. Other victims suffered flash burns. Some obviously suffered both at the same time. And then we have the famous atomic shadows allegedly left behind by people who were evaporated in an instant, and only their shadows were left behind on the wall or the pavement. And if we conclude, as I propose we should, that there were indeed no nuclear detonations, then we also have to consider why was this staged? And why would the Japanese have failed to notice what was going on? How were they being fooled, right? So we will go through all of this today in a little bit of detail. Here's the book which I have written on the topic. You can find it for free at my website or also on archive.org. You can also buy print copies on Lulu or Amazon if you are so inclined. One key point is that in this book, I list all the references for the evidence I will show, right? So these are mostly published books and scientific papers, so I won't go through these references today. You can all look them up in the book if you are interested. So let's start with this gentleman who was an early eyewitness of the damage done by the bombings in both of these cities. Okay, so Alexander Seversky, he had actually grown up in Russia. He had been a fighter pilot for his native country in World War I, and shortly after, probably because of the revolution and its the living conditions engendered by it, he fled the country, went to the United States. And there he became a successful engineer and constructor of combat aircraft, and he had very good connections to the US government. And after World War II, he was sent on an inspection tour of the bombed-out cities, both in Germany and in Japan, and he had seen many cities destroyed by conventional bombings before visiting Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And if you read the quote here from a book of his, then he professes astonishment that Hiroshima and Nagasaki look the same as the other cities. So this quote only deals with Hiroshima, but he confirms later on explicitly also for Nagasaki. Okay, and he also shows some pictures, and this is a picture of downtown Hiroshima. Hiroshima is situated in a river delta, so this is one of the delta arms that traverse the city. And the buildings here are more or less directly at the hypocenter. So the hypocenter is the point on the ground that is directly beneath the detonation of the atomic bomb, and the atomic bomb is said to have been set off at a height of approximately 600 meters above ground. So what he points out is that these buildings are still standing. They are obviously damaged, some of them severely, but other steel concrete structures are still standing. And he says that the extent of destruction in the city was actually less than in Berlin, for example. What had been completely destroyed were the many wooden buildings, right? Both cities, as many other Japanese cities, consisted mostly of wooden buildings of traditional construction, and they simply had been burned to the ground. But as far as the force of the explosion went, there was nothing unusual to be seen in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we can conclude that the extent of destruction did not exceed that seen in other cities, and does not force us to conclude that something very unusual had been going on. Then we turn to the radioactive bomb fallout. Right, I already mentioned that we had two different bomb types in the two cities. The Hiroshima bomb is said to have consisted of 50 kilograms of enriched uranium-235. And of that, only approximately 1 kilogram is said to have actually fission. So the other 49 kilograms should have come down and been found somewhere on the ground. Obviously not all of it in the city, but there should have been a decent amount of it in the city. And from the 1 kilogram of fissioned uranium-235, there should have been formed about 35 grams of cesium-137, which is widely used as a fallout marker. And in Nagasaki, the plutonium bomb is said to have contained 6 kilogram plutonium-239, and again about 1 kilogram is said to have fission, producing a similar amount of cesium, and the other 5 kilograms should have been found on the ground. So how much stuff was actually found on the ground? What we have here is a gamma ray spectrum from an early soil sample from Hiroshima. So this sample was taken only about 3 days after the bombing in Hiroshima, so before the fallout could have been washed away by rain or blown away by the wind. Apparently the weather was sunny and dry at the time. And so in a gamma ray spectrum, what you do is you separate the radiation emitted by all these different isotopes which you may have in your sample according to the energy, right? So each isotope emits gamma rays with a characteristic energy, and you can separate those, and then each isotope will produce one of these peaks here. And what we see here in black is the mixture of natural background radioactivity. The highest peak is due to potassium-40, right, fairly close to the right-hand side, this highest peak there. And then you see the cesium-137, which is artificial, and it produces only a tiny peak, which I have highlighted here in red. Now, this measurement was carried out in 1996, so approximately 50 years after the supposed nuclear bombing. In that time, the cesium would have already decayed to an extent of about 2/3. So had the same measurement been carried out in 1945, the peak should have been 3 times higher than it actually was, but still it would have been a lot lower than several of the natural peaks here. So that means there was only a tiny amount of cesium that was reaching the ground at that point, certainly a lot less than you would have expected. So, another point to observe is that, as already mentioned, in later decades, in the 50s, mostly many countries carried out nuclear bomb tests, right? So that was the United States, but also Russia, and then later on China and so on. And the fallout from these bomb tests, right, reached the atmosphere and was dispersed across the globe, particularly the northern hemisphere. And you can find this fallout radioactivity everywhere. You can also find it in Hiroshima, and you actually find more fallout derived from these later bomb tests in Hiroshima than you find fallout from 1945. So that essentially already tells you the story. You don't really need to go any further than that, but one can go further and can actually make more specific arguments. The next thing here we have a very interesting study The sample in question is shown in the picture. This is a plasterboard, a piece of plasterboard from a house in Hiroshima, whose roof had been blown up. So apparently, due to the setting off of some conventional explosives, the roof had been blown off, and then this plasterboard became soiled by droplets of black rain. You may have heard that the so-called black rain in Hiroshima carried the fallout, right? So this is just as good a sample of fallout as it gets. So you have the droplets, the residue of droplets of black rain directly on the plasterboard here. So now uranium is actually somewhat ubiquitous in nature, so you have to expect some natural background uranium in the plaster itself. So the samples taken from the plasterboard can contain in principle, can contain uranium from the bomb and also from natural background. Now, since the bomb uranium is enriched for uranium-235, you should be able to tell from the mixture of the two isotopes in your sample what fraction comes from the bomb and what fraction comes from the background. And you may have guessed it, the highest amount that you can find derived from the bomb is no more than 0.2%, right? So 99.8% of the stuff in the sample comes from the plaster, and only 0.2% would come from the bomb. That is, if you believe that indeed the stuff that was dispersed at the time was indeed as highly as enriched as claimed. And it can be shown also from other studies that it was indeed not, right? It was only very weakly enriched. In keeping also with the meeting protocol, which I already mentioned, they simply did not have the technology at the time to produce highly enriched uranium in relevant amounts. So, in conclusion, in Hiroshima, we find only tiny amounts of fission products, cesium being the marker for that, and also of the bomb uranium. What we do find, however, in Hiroshima is not only cesium, but also plutonium. Okay? Now, plutonium is formed from uranium-235 in reactor fuel, right? So in reactor fuel, you have a bit of enriched uranium-235, you have lots of uranium-238, and this uranium-238 can capture some of the neutrons released by the fission of uranium-235, and then it turns into plutonium-239. This happens in the reactor, but it should happen only to a very, very small degree in a detonating uranium-235 bomb. Nevertheless, in the Hiroshima fallout, you do find plutonium in amounts that are characteristic of reactor fuel. So what this means is that the material that was dispersed in Hiroshima did not come from any detonating device. It simply was reactor waste. It was reactor material. Now, the authors of the studies, this was a Japanese group of researchers. They expressed surprise at finding this plutonium in these samples. And so they are actually taking precautions to avoid contamination of their samples by the global fallout from later bomb tests. And they did this by sampling soil from underneath wooden houses that had been built shortly after the bombings in the Hiroshima area. Okay, so then this fallout should have been, right, the soil should have been protected from the fallout from later bomb tests. So they explain it by postulating that somehow the fallout got underneath these houses anyway, but this doesn't wash for two reasons. The first one is that the fallout underneath these houses is stuck at the surface of the soil, right, which is shown here on the left. So the authors showed 4 samples, and in 3 of them, the highest amount of radioactivity was found at the very top of the sample. And in the 4th sample, it was found at a depth of 5 centimeters. In soil samples taken simply in the open, right? So this soil would have received both the radioactivity dispersed in 1945 and during later bomb tests, we see that the fallout has migrated. So probably due to percolating rainwater, it is now found at a depth of 5 to 10 centimeters in the soil. But that is still too slow. This rate of transport obviously is way too slow to cause any sort of transport from soil outside the houses to underneath those houses. So this proposed mechanism of contamination simply doesn't apply. We have to conclude that the plutonium found in these samples was indeed dispersed already in 1945, and therefore indeed that reactor material was dispersed. Okay, let's turn to Nagasaki. In Nagasaki, we actually find higher levels of fallout. It also includes a fair amount of plutonium, but somewhat strangely, we find it at a distance of approximately 3 kilometers from the hypocenter in the Nishiyama Reservoir. That's a small artificial body of water, right? There's really no obvious reason why so much fallout should be concentrated there, but it is. Now, how this has come about? We actually will get to the bottom of it, and quite literally so, because in the year 2008, a group of Japanese researchers did a detailed study on the fallout. What they did do was to drill up a core of sediment from this reservoir, right? So they drilled into the sediment to a depth of apparently at least 470 centimeters. They pulled up this plug, right, and sliced it up and looked for the amount of radioactivity in each of the slices. And at a depth of approximately 440 centimeters, they find a high peak of radioactivity that includes both plutonium and also cesium. Now, what they also find is a layer that contains charcoal particles. And that layer is about 15 centimeters below the radioactivity. And so they ascribe these charcoal particles to the soot of the burning city, right? Both cities burned up after being bombed in 1945. I think that's a plausible explanation for these charcoal particles, but we then have to conclude that obviously since these two markers are not found in the same layer in the sediment, they were probably deposited at different times. And if we simply calculate the average rate of deposition over time, then we get approximately 7 centimeters per year. So then this difference in height within the sediment would amount to a difference in time of approximately 2 years. And now we remember that Arthur Compton in 1945 said he would need another 2 years before he would be able to purify plutonium. So this actually fits quite well. So it really seems that as soon as the Americans had finally managed to purify plutonium, they dumped some of it into this reservoir in order to fake, for the benefit of later researchers, the presence of nuclear fallout from these bombs. And they apparently had not expected somebody to undertake such a detailed study as this Japanese group. I have to note that the Japanese researchers, they don't draw the same conclusions as I do. They say that the mechanism of separation is not understood. It needs further investigation. But I think the most straightforward explanation is simply that these two substances were deposited at different points in time. Okay, so these were, right, so the fallout evidence is clearly fake. There is lots more fake physical evidence, and I will only go over one example to show what was done, to illustrate what was done. So if we have a chain reaction going off in the air, what should be happening is that uranium nuclei capture neutrons, and they fission into two smaller products, sometimes three, and release more secondary neutrons, right? And then some of these secondary neutrons cause the fission of more nuclei of uranium, and therefore we have a chain reaction. But other neutrons, some of these neutrons, they escape the center of the detonation and strike the ground. And on the ground, they do two things. They contribute to the radiation dose received by the people on the ground, or they simply strike some soil, and the atomic nuclei in the soil, they can capture these neutrons, and then some of them will actually turn radioactive. An example being cobalt-59, which is stable. It can capture a neutron, becomes cobalt-60, and cobalt-60 is radioactive, has a half-life of approximately 6 years, so it can be measured many years later. Okay? Now, you can do this, and you can then, from such measurements, try to infer how intense the neutron radiation must have been at the time of the bombing. And if you do this for different isotopes, you have to apply different corrections for time, right? Because the half-lives differ. You have to, in your back calculation, apply different correction factors in order to arrive at the correct neutron those neutron fluents at the time of the event. In principle, the estimates from different isotopes, from different radioactive isotopes induced by capture of neutrons, they should all agree, but we see that they actually differ, right? Quite considerably. We have 3 different isotopes, cobalt-60 and europium-154 and 152. They all differ from each other, but if we assume that maybe the irradiation did not happen in 1945, but it happened 3 years later, or 3.5 years later, then we see that they almost perfectly agree. Okay, so I suspect that this particular sample was fabricated in the lab sometime in 1948 or maybe 1949, which is a similar time frame to the fakery going on around the deposition of the fallout in Nagasaki. So this is just one example. In my book, I discuss a couple more examples of evidence that is just replete with internal contradiction, clearly indicating that it was fake. Okay, so this much about the physical evidence. Now, if we conclude from our analysis of this physical evidence that there were no nukes, then we have to wonder, how did all these cases of acute radiation sickness come about? And these cases are quite numerous. So you have lots of eyewitness reports. You also have medical reports that describe people suffering bone marrow failure. One symptom caused by bone marrow failure is lack of blood platelets, thrombocytes, and this causes bleeding. And as you can see, right, bleeding in the skin. You can see in the young man on the left who actually died on the day after this photograph was taken. And also the hair follicles tend to be quite susceptible to radiation. So then this causes hair loss, as you can see in the boy on the right. Other symptoms, right, you also have a failure of the leukocytes, which are important for defense against infections. So you also have infections, high fever, and so on. Often the infection affects the oral cavity. Okay, so how do we explain this? The first thing is we can ask is, could it be, after all, explained by radiation? If indeed the story of the nuclear bombs were true, then what we should expect is a very distinctive distribution of radiation sickness around the hypocenter. You have very high doses within the first kilometer from the hypocenter, so much so that everybody who would be exposed to the radiation out in the open without any shielding from building, they should be dead, right? They should succumb sooner or later to acute radiation sickness. On the other hand, since the dose actually drops off with distance quite steeply, beyond 1.5 or 2 kilometers, you actually should see very little acute radiation sickness. Beyond 2 kilometers, you should essentially see no radiation sickness and no death. Okay, the question is this actually observed in reality? And we see that it is not. On the left-hand side here in the diagram, right on the right-hand side, we see the expectation. So everybody should be dead within 1 kilometer of acute radiation sickness as long as he was exposed out in the open. But we see that it's not the case. So only about among those who survived the first 3 weeks after the bombing, only 20% actually died. So that's actually, sorry, these numbers are illustrated here on the right-hand side of this diagram. So only about 20% died when in fact all should have died. On the other hand, beyond 2 kilometers, we should see neither symptoms of acute radiation sickness nor death. And we see that both actually continue beyond 2 kilometers. Particularly symptoms of acute radiation sickness are found in Hiroshima even beyond 4 kilometers from the hypocenters, right? And this is clearly a contradiction to the official story. We also see the same effect in later studies, right? So around 1960, the atomic, what's it called? The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? So they maintained 2 research outfits there. So they tried to determine in hindsight the individual radiation doses that each of the survivors would have received, right? So they had first carried out some physical experiments to determine the reach of nuclear radiation as a function of distance from the center of the detonation. And then they carried out interviews with all of these survivors, and then they tried to estimate for each of them how much radiation they would have received, right? So what should result from such determinations is something similar to the curve we see on the left. That curve shows mortality among rhesus monkeys that were exposed to a later nuclear test of some sort at different distances. And what you see here is a very steep transition from survival to death. Below a dose of 4 gray, all the monkeys survive, and above a dose of 6 gray, they all die essentially. And you should see a similarly steep transition with the acute radiation sickness symptoms, but you don't. Among these survivors, you see that even at a dose of 6 gray, only about half of them actually have symptoms of acute radiation sickness, right? So the data points, they scatter, they are all over the map. So this means that the predictive power of this model of the atomic detonations just simply doesn't work. One specific example is actually found in a very early report by the Red Cross Committee. We see it here this is a report from 1945, and this is a young man. You may not be able to read it, but he actually experienced typical symptoms of radiation sickness such as bleeding, hair loss, loss of white blood cells, high fever, and so on, and he succumbed. Okay. Another key point is we have acute radiation sickness not only among those who were in the city at the time, but also among several hundred late entrants to Hiroshima. Okay, so the quote on the right is from an official document. This reflects the official story, right? So in a nuclear bomb detonation, radiation should only be released and received for a few seconds during the detonation itself. Okay, so everybody who was outside the city at the time should have been protected from acute radiation sickness. Nevertheless, we see that acute radiation sickness was quite common among those people who spent several days near the hypocenter, probably to help with rescue and recovery. So that's another clear contradiction to the official story. Then we have anecdotal reports of miraculous survival, right? We have an early report by an American physician who was working at Osaka at the time, and he interviewed a patient who claimed to have been practically direct at the hypocenter, right? And survived it. I mean, he should have died immediately due to the blast force and due to the radiation, but he still managed to get somehow to Osaka and to at least survive long enough to relate his story to this physician. And then I already mentioned those interviews, and when the survivors in those interviews claimed or reported to have been very close to the center of the detonation, then they were simply brushed off, and the interviewers simply assumed that they were just telling a fantasy tale. So this is how objectively these scientific investigations were carried out. Then we have Ashley Otterson. He was a surgeon from Yale. He actually was heading up an investigative committee at Hiroshima. He professed to have been puzzled by some of these observations, and when he reported his findings in 1956, he did so in the nick of time, because a short time later he was actually killed in a plane crash in Colombia, and several of his colleagues apparently also died while still young, but they could not find out when exactly and where exactly they were caught by their fate. Okay, so then the question is, if it wasn't bombs, then what was it? And it turns out we don't even have to look very far. We can find plenty of eyewitness testimony. People reported having inhaled some poisonous gas, particularly here this schoolboy, Hisato Ito. He began to lose his hair when he breathed the gases when the bomb fell. Okay, so he breathed in some poisonous gas that made him lose his hair. He actually died shortly after writing this down of leukemia. We also have Australian journalist Wilfrid Burchett, who managed to sneak into Hiroshima, and even then he noticed a sulfuric smell, and the Japanese he talked to were talking to him about poisonous gas, and they ascribed this poisonous gas to radioactivity, which of course is not very sensible, but they simply had been told a bullshit story about radioactivity somehow producing poisonous gas, because the experience was so commonplace that poisonous gas had been around that it had to be explained in order to simply be denied. Of course, in the West, we were never told about poisonous gas at all. Okay, so here we have the most likely culprit. This is sulfur mustard, right? Here you have the structural formula. The sulfur atom is right in the middle. You may know it's a battle gas that was used by both sides in World War I. It stinks, it smells like garlic, onions, or rotten eggs, and even so it's called a gas. It's an oily fluid with a high boiling point and also with a high density. It can persist in the environment for weeks and months, and this would explain both the delayed effects on people who came to the city only afterwards, and it could also explain the observations by Burchett. The sulfur mustard reacts with DNA. I'm not going to go through the steps here, but what it does, it introduces cross-links between the two strands of a DNA molecule, and these the reaction products are hard to repair for the cell, so the damage to the DNA, even so it's structurally different from the damage done by radiation, has similar biological effects. The DNA damage ultimately explains the biological effects on the bone marrow and other rapidly proliferating tissues such as the intestinal mucous membranes and, for example, hair follicles. So this explains the similarities between the effects of sulfur mustard and of radiation, but there are also some differences. Radiation is very penetrating, so it can hit the bone marrow and the intestinal membranes, for example, without doing much damage outwardly to the skin, for example. But sulfur mustard being a chemical, has to be taken up somehow, either by inhalation or across the skin, and it will actually cause some damage to the skin and to the lung in the process. And it also damages the circulation and causes what's called capillary leak syndrome, right? So that is actually exactly what the name suggests. You have a leakiness of the blood circulation, so the blood fluid seeps out of the circulation into the tissues. The tissues swell up. The patients, or the victims, they suffer extreme thirst. And in keeping with this, in eyewitness testimony from both cities, you find reports of people drinking from rivers, pools, and puddles, anything, any kind of water they would get, and their bodies were swelled up grotesquely so that you couldn't really tell men from women except by the length of the hair, and so on and so forth. Also, inhaled mustard gas will cause toxic lung edema, and this also jibes with eyewitness testimony from both cities. And then we don't have a lot of pathology data, but that little bit that we do have also gives clear indications. Here we have a cross-section of lung tissue from a boy who died 3 days after the Hiroshima bombing. And what we see here in this lung tissue are the alveoli. These are the white air-filled spaces. In healthy lung tissue, they should all be of identical or similar size. But what we see here is that some of the alveoli are grossly inflated and others compressed, and this is due to the obstruction, due to the chemical damage done by sulfur mustard on the smallest bronchi. And that's a typical picture that you find described in handbooks on the effects of mustard gas. It is absolutely not typical for the damage of radiation. Radiation indeed does very little acute damage, if any at all, to lung tissue, at least at doses that are not immediately deadly. Then we also have reports of peeling skin and mucous membranes in bombing victims, right? So you may know that mustard gas is a vesicant, so it causes the skin to peel. That's very typical. I'm not going to read these quotes to you. And then we can turn to the so-called flash burns. Okay, so what were these flash burns? Here we have we have 2 victims of napalm burns, and we have 1 victim of nuclear flash burn. So which one is different? They are not different from each other. They are all the same, right? In each case, we have circumscribed lesions. We have have irregular boundaries, but we have a clear sudden transition from healthy skin to the burnt tissue. If you have a burn caused by light, what you would expect is that the burn is everywhere where the light touched the skin. So these kind of patterns cannot be reconciled with the idea that this damage was done by burns and by a flash of light. But on the other hand, napalm burns fit the picture perfectly. And we also have similar reports to match from the days of the bombing itself. So here we have a witness report from the diary of a physician from Hiroshima who describes a situation that should remind us of the famous napalm girl picture that everyone has seen. Then we also have the retinal burns. Okay, so an intense flash of light that enters the eye should be focused on one spot on the retina and should cause some sort of intense burn there. And this indeed happened in later bomb tests. So what we see here in the picture is the eye ground of a GI, of an American soldier, who had looked at the flash of a later bomb test. And you see this volcano-like structure in the middle. That is the scar of that burn. So then the question is, how many clinical case reports do we have from Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And the number is exactly 0. There's not a single such report in the literature, right? So we do have lots of eyewitnesses who report having looked into the flash, so we must assume some flash indeed happened. But on the other hand, it was clearly not intense enough to cause these kinds of retinal burns. Then the atomic shadows. Sorry, I have to take a sip of water. Then the atomic shadows. We have eyewitness reports, right? I already mentioned Seversky, who also visited the 2 cities in early September. he had reported that there was nothing unusual to be seen in these two cities, right? For 2 days he searched the city, but he couldn't find anything unusual. The shadows here, right, the shadows of the posts of the bridge railing, they were to be seen on a bridge within 1 kilometer of the hypocenter, right? So somebody would probably have pointed them out to him if they had already existed. On the other hand, we find in the diary of Avril Lebo, who came to the city on October 13th, that in many locations in those cities, shadows were to be found, and he even arranged some sort of a grand tour to show his guests around, okay? And the bridge he mentions in this quote here is the very one in the picture. So what we can conclude from this is that the special effects teams who created these shadows, they must have been quite busy in September. And if we look at this example of this bridge in particular, we can also compare the length of the shadows to the length of the posts and compare this to expectation. We know where the bridge is located relative to the hypocenter. We know how high up in the air the detonation is supposed to occur, and from that we can calculate how long the shadows should have been. And we see that the shadows should have been considerably longer than they were actually found to be in reality. So therefore, whatever these shadows are, I suspect these are simply just paint that was spray painted onto the pavement, but whatever they are, they don't match the story of the atomic bombing. So what this means is some more physical evidence that points the other way. So then we have the beautiful cloud, okay? So we can first wonder, why should there be any atomic clouds at all? There shouldn't be, because there is nothing that's burning up. There is no release of any chemical products really in a nuclear detonation. There's only heat being released. So what we should see is actually simply a flash. And if there were already any naturally formed clouds in the vicinity, they should evaporate. There shouldn't be a formation of new clouds. There should only be an evaporation of any clouds already existing. On top of that, the particular cloud in Hiroshima is described by eyewitnesses is very colorful, right, as shown here in this quote. And what we can assume is that probably colored smoke bombs were used in the creation of these clouds. And indeed, there is one eyewitness report from Hiroshima of a woman who had a purple-colored smoke bomb going up in her living room. So more fakery. Then we can wonder overall, how was it done? So I already mentioned that some sort of flash was created, the cloud was created, the flash may have been magnesium flash bombs, photo flash bombs. That's hard to reconstruct from the very limited evidence, might also have been a so-called thermobaric weapons. Then we have napalm burns, and eyewitness testimony suggests that napalm bombs were detonated high up above the city, and that the burning napalm gobs, they were simply raining down on the city. I suppose the sulfur mustard was delivered in the same way, so also the bombs were set to go off within that cloud. So the cloud was simply a trick. It was a smoke screen in effect, right, to hide all the entire trickery that was going on later. Then we have the black rain to consider. I suppose this was simply reactor waste. And the black rain is described by eyewitnesses as oily. So I think that they somehow contrived to dissolve the reactor waste in some oily matrix, and they dispersed this oily fluid onto the ground. And to hide the dispersal of this black rain, they also made some watery rain. So there was actually a substantial volume of regular watery rain also coming down at the same time. And I think that watery rain was intended to disguise the black oily rain. Now the oily rain was not supposed to be black. It simply turned black because the oil droplets picked up soot on the way down through through the clouds from the burning city. So I think that this was sort of backfired on them. They tried to disguise the dispersal of reactor waste, but they actually made it quite conspicuous. Of course, the proper explanation hasn't been provided until today. Okay. Okay, so then another point is after the bombings had been staged, the aftermath had to be managed in order to prevent the truth from coming out, right? Particularly the widespread experience of poison gas was simply blamed on the radioactivity. I even found quoted in one scientific report the term atom bomb gas. So even the medical community was deceived into believing that atomic bombs somehow produced harmful gas. Atomic shadows were spray painted. We have already covered that. And then another important point is very heavy censorship of medical research. So very little medical data came out, particularly in the first couple of years. But that little bit that did come out already contains some interesting findings. For example, those napalm burns that were passed off as flash burns. Then another point is, if these bombings were staged, how were the Japanese authorities deceived? I mean, it's one thing to deceive the population, but it's another thing to deceive the government, which has at its disposal military experts, medical experts, physical experts, and so on. What I believe is that the Japanese were not deceived at all. I think they were actually coerced into collaborating with staging these bombings. Okay, there are several signs to indicate that indeed they were not deceived. For example, they didn't trigger an air alarm, but there must have been many American airplanes in the air to deliver all this of various kinds of orders we have discussed. There is an official report by the US government estimating that in Hiroshima, some 200 planes, even more than that, would have been needed that would have delivered conventional explosives and incendiaries in order to achieve the observed extent of destruction. The Japanese would have seen those planes in the air and they should have triggered an air alarm, but they didn't. Okay, indeed, they actually cancelled an air alarm in Hiroshima that had been enforced just a few minutes before the actual bombing occurred. And there are more indications that indeed the Japanese were not deceived. So then the question is, how were they coerced into colluding? We already have discussed the firebombing campaign, right? Beginning in March 1945, Tokyo was bombed first, and then every major and mid-sized city in Japan was destroyed after that. Japan depended on food import, and their military situation getting ever more desperate prevented them from receiving these supplies. And the Russians were obviously preparing to enter into the war. Indeed, they did enter on the same day as the Nagasaki bombing. And one might also speculate that some of the atrocities that were committed by the Americans in Germany, for example, the Dresden bombing, but also, for example, the Rhine-Wiesen death camps, in which, according to James Buck, approximately 1 million soldiers, prisoners, were starved to death, that these were also staged, or these were also carried out in order to send a message to the Japanese, right, that they better go along with staging these nuclear bombings, because otherwise they would suffer an even worse fate. Okay, then we might wonder, why was it done? And again, we don't really have to be super sleuths in order to find out why, because the nuclear scare propaganda, which began immediately afterwards, actually tips us off. We have here a propaganda booklet to which very illustrious scientists contributed: Einstein himself, Seelert, Wigner, Hans Bethe. And the title already gives the game away: One World or None. And Lilius Seelert actually spelled it out for us. We need a world government in order to save the world from nuclear destruction. This is what it was about. It was a terror attack. It was intended to scare the world populace into willingly giving up their national sovereignties and submitting to a new and benevolent world government. And the people who took it upon themselves to further spread this message in the years afterwards, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. They have, in the meantime, also adopted very many other worthy causes, right? They were on top of the COVID agenda, they pushed climate change and so on. And they have this world-famous doomsday clock, which is perennially stuck at a couple of seconds or minutes to midnight. Right, so here you see two true scientists, obviously, next to their cherished doomsday clock. You can also buy an entire book about the doomsday clock at 75. The saying is, even a broken clock is right twice a day, but this doomsday clock seems to be the exception. So even at 75 years, it has never been right even once. Then we have testimony by Werner Heisenberg on first learning of the Hiroshima bombing. He said it's got nothing to do with atoms. Okay, Heisenberg at the time was actually interned together with the entire elite of the German nuclear physics in England. And their reaction to the news of the Hiroshima bombing was carefully recorded. The question is why? Why did they intern these people at the time? It was already clear at the time that Germany, after all, had not pursued its own atomic bomb program. So there was really nothing to be learned from these people, or was there? I suspect, but cannot prove, that the reason for interning these people and to listening in on their conversations on the atomic bombs, on supposed atomic bombs, was that they just might come up with a clear-cut argument for why these stories had to be wrong, had to be false. And I think if they had come up with such an argument, that would probably have been it for them. So lucky for them, they didn't really persevere with this initial reaction, but later on became persuaded that after all, the atomic bombing story may have been true, and so therefore they were actually released in January of 1946. Okay, we have already discussed this book by Akio Nakatani, so I would suggest that you look at it. The problem is nowadays you can't find it anymore on Amazon, so you would have to track it down somehow secondhand. And finally, another plug for my own book. Again, you can find it for free in electronic format, or you can buy a print copy. And in this book, I go over everything at greater depth. I discuss additional medical and physical findings which further support the conclusions I have presented here. Thank you very much.
Why did let's just assume that the atomic bombs were real. Why did the US only choose two cities? Why was Tokyo firebombed in the same year, and why was Dresden? I mean, let's be honest, right? I mean, Germany was like the ultimate enemy of the Allies. No nuclear bombs dropped on Germany. But only these two cities in Japan.
Well, the official story is that they got the atomic bombs to work only just in time, right? So the first atomic test is supposed to have been carried out in July 1945. By that time, Germany had already capitulated, so was already out of the war. And Japan then capitulated shortly after, right? So the story as it's told is that Japan refused to surrender, and the Americans were on the verge of invading the country, and this would have entailed lots more additional losses. So then they tried the atomic bombs in order to persuade Japan to give up, and then Japan actually did give up in the end. Okay, so at the superficial level, this story is believable.
I've looked at photographs of Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, and they all look very similar.
Yes, well, that's what Desiversky also said, right? He also says that Hiroshima and Nagasaki really didn't visibly distinguish themselves in any way, so there was no reason to assume that anything special had occurred in those cities. But that's only the directly visible signs. So I think that, for example, the so-called radiation sickness, that is clearly different, right? So there must have been something more than just firebombing in the end.
Yes, but what I mean is a lot of the concrete structures in all three of those cities remained.
That is true. That is correct. So it seems that in Germany, you had mostly stone structures, fairly solid Western construction, right? So you had there was a need for breaking through those structures. So the Allies actually used lots of explosives in their bombing campaigns, whereas in Japan you had largely buildings of light wooden construction, and so they used mostly incendiaries in those cities. They did also use some sort of explosives in Hiroshima, for example. So there are reports of houses having immediately collapsed after some air burst and this sort of thing. So some explosives were used there as well. But obviously, these explosives were not any stronger than those used in other places.
The Manhattan Project famously had hundreds of thousands of people working on it.
Yes.
What were they working on, and were there that many people?
I have no idea, but I have really not looked into that question, whether how many people were really employed there. Most of them must have been working some sort of bullshit jobs. So probably, if they were even employed, I suspect these lists may have been fictitious, and the money for the salaries might simply have been stolen. Oppenheimer and his friends at Los Alamos, they may have done some calculations, but not a lot more. They may have done some small-scale experiments, for example, the one which I initially mentioned, carried out by Robert Wilson. But the crucial fact is they simply had no nuclear fuel from which to assemble any kind of nuclear bomb. So all their work was essentially fictitious, right? The real physical work was apparently mostly done in Chicago, University of Chicago. So this is where the first reactors were built by Enrico Fermi. And they apparently also had very capable chemists there who would purify all manner of nuclear fission products from the reactor material, from Fermi's reactors. And then this was used again also in Chicago in animal experiments. So they have detailed animal experiments to study every different purified fission products and its biological effects on experimental animals. They did that. They also tested in parallel, interestingly enough, the effects of mustard gas on those same animals, right? Or on other animals of the same species. They published a report on it. The findings with the various fission products are carefully documented in that report. The findings with mustard gas are left out from the report, and no mention is made of the atomic bombings, even though this report was published only in 1948, I think it was, or was it 49? So even though the atomic bombings had supposedly already occurred, there is absolutely no mention of them. There's no attempt to correlate these experimental findings with observations from the two cities, which is quite striking, I would say.
Most, if not all, of the photos that we see of the famous mushroom cloud were given to us by the Allies, not by the Japanese.
Yes.
And I've tried finding photos from Japanese photographers.
Yeah.
And there are very few, and they look very different.
Yes. Well, yes. I don't know how genuine the photos of those mushrooms clouds really are that are given to us by the Allies. I have no trust in any of the photographic records, in any of the data and information they gave us. I think what the Japanese photographers caught was simply the smoke clouds from the burning cities, right? So within a couple of minutes or half an hour of the bombings, both cities were aflame. And there were huge, big smoke plumes rising from those cities. And I think that's what you find in the Japanese imagery. But the eyewitness testimonies report really all in unison that these smoke clouds, or these mushroom clouds, they already formed at the very beginning, within the very first minute of the attack, essentially. So it's not. This wasn't all. So the smoke plumes of the burning cities, they were certainly real, but this was not all, right? I mean, both the early formation of the mushroom clouds and then also the description of those clouds as colorful and so on, some other special elements clearly show that there was something more than just the burning cities. So this was part of the fireworks, let's call it that, right? So I think very elaborate fireworks were used to stage those bombings, and the formation very early on of these mushroom clouds was part of it. And I think it was simply, these mushroom clouds were simply intended as smoke screens in order to conceal from the people on the ground what was really going on.
Was Bikini Atoll significant in any way?
Well, on Bikini, the bomb tests, several bomb tests were supposed to, I think 2 of them, were supposed to have been held in 1946. That would still be before the Manhattan Project would have been able to purify plutonium. Nevertheless, those bomb tests were supposed to have been carried out with plutonium also. So one must assume that these tests were also fake. And the imagery looks pretty fake as well. I mean, there's lots of fake-looking imagery from later bomb tests, so it's very difficult to know what exactly went on in these bomb tests in later times. On the other hand, something must have been done there. I think the fallout is real enough. I think many investigators have confirmed independently from each other the presence of fission products in soil samples from all over the world, and I guess this would be very difficult to fake. And unless all of these people are in on the deception, I think one has to conclude that the fallout is real.
Well, speaking of people being in on it, who would have been in on it in terms of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? There's the famous Enola Gay and the pilot and his small crew that were quoted multiple times. How many? I mean, do you think that the amount of people involved at the top would have been very small?
I think that I cannot put a real number to it, but I think only overall a small minority of all people working within the Manhattan Project or in the US military would have been in on it, to at least entirely, right? I mean, probably the pilot and his crew, they would have known that it was obviously fake, right? That they were not even delivering any particular audit. I can't track it down right now, but I found a picture of this crew standing next to their Enola Gay plane and grinning as if they were just in on a very big joke somehow. You know, I mean, they don't look like people on a mission that is crucial, possibly dangerous, might decide the war. You would expect a facial expression of some seriousness, a little grim faces. They were just standing there and grinning as if there is just some sort of festivity in progress. You know, so it's a bit odd. Then, among the scientists, I think, I talked about the meeting on May 31st, 1945. You have the top tier of the scientists participating in the project there. I think every one of the scientists there would have known what the real state of affairs was, because they all kept silent as Compton told the fib of uranium bombs being in production. Nobody objected to that. Leslie Groves himself would have known it. On the other hand, I think this story about uranium bombs being in production was probably told to deceive some of the military officers and politicians in attendance. I think they were being kept in the dark on purpose. I'm not even sure Truman himself knew what was going on. I suspect Truman himself was deceived as to the reality of the bombings. I think he was led to believe that he was indeed ordering atomic bombings, and that these bombings were at least atomic, at least at the time. I think he was deceived about it, but that's pretty much conjecture. I think it fits better to his attitude displayed here and there than the opposite.
Why has the Japanese government not said anything?
Well, they were told better not to tell anything about it. I think that they were really massively threatened and blackmailed. I think they really didn't want to go along with it, but in the end, they saw no other way. I think that the entire conventional bombing campaign of the year 1945 was really needed to beat them into submission, and they only really relented when it became obvious that the Soviet Union would join the war, which they did anyway in the end, right? Because Japan had at the time occupied Manchuria in northern China. The Japanese forces, their land forces, they had already been hollowed out. They were in no position to offer resistance to the massive onslaught of the Soviet forces. The Japanese had also taken a significant number of settlers across, so civilian, I'm not sure about the exact number, but it was more than 1 million Japanese civilians they actually had settled in Manchuria. And when the Japanese defense collapsed within days, really, they actually suffered a grim fate. So many of them were killed or raped, this sort of thing, So they suffered a very grim fate. So the Japanese really only gave up and relented and agreed to go along with it, I believe, a short time before the bombings actually were staged. And I guess these threats didn't end there. I guess that if the Japanese government were ever to acknowledge the truth, I think they would still suffer punishment even today.
How can I get your book?
You can find it on lulu.com, and you can also find it on amazon.com. If you simply look for the title, Hiroshima Revisited, you should be able to find it. And you can find the electronic version free on my website at mpalmer.heresy.is. And you can find it also on archive.org.
All right. On that note, Michael Palmer, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity. Enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much.